Hello, and welcome to this overview of Chapter 5, the final chapter. I've chosen this background because I figure this represents the sweat of your brow as you've gone through these 2 semesters with this thesis. So the end is in sight. You're almost finished. I've discussed with most of you your Chapter 4, your data and the statistical tests you need, and you're working on Chapter 4. So this is to prepare you to finish up Chapter 5. So basically the sections for Chapter 5 are an introduction. You're going to do a short section for each hypothesis, any additional research findings, a conclusions section, which is different from a conclusion of the whole piece, but a conclusions of your findings and your analysis of your findings, educational implications, and then summary and conclusion. In all of these sections, well, in the first sections, the sample is going to be very useful. It doesn't have a summary, a real good summary and conclusion, but it'll be a little bit helpful. So in the introduction, once again, you're going to basically restate your overall hypothesis like you've done in the other chapters. You're going to give a little description of whether, a little summary of whether your individual hypotheses were supported or not. In the sample, it indicates that 3 of 4 hypotheses predicting the results were confirmed. You may have a lot, you may have not a lot. It depends on how your hypotheses were. They may all be supported, and we're not going to use the term that your hypotheses were proved. All we can say is that your hypotheses were supported by the results. Even if you're super statistically significant, it's still not proof in the jargon of statistical reporting and writing. You can also put something in here, a quick unexpected findings. For example, I think in one of the examples, not in the sample, but the other one, it says something about I had this all laid out and then I lost it. I wanted to keep the wordings here. There were several unexpected findings regarding the ages at which this development occurs. So if there's unexpected, either you don't go into detail here. That's where you're going to go into detail. You're just summarizing what you're going to talk about. So a paragraph would be sufficient for the beginning of that. You're going to list each hypothesis, much as you did in Chapter 4, and then under each hypothesis, you're not going to repeat the data that you included in Chapter 4, but the outcome. Did it support your hypothesis or not? And then the reason or rationale for whether it supported or didn't support. So here you can talk about some experimental flaws. Maybe it wasn't long enough. If you think that perhaps a longer duration might have showed more positive results and supported your hypothesis, that's perfectly fine to mention. We're limited by the structure and time you have to do a thesis, so it's perfectly legitimate that in a master's thesis the duration would be too short. Maybe we realized after all, and that's a flaw. That's not a flaw. That's just that's more of an explanation. The duration. Maybe as part of our design we didn't include a control group, and when you tried to interpret and analyze your results, you realized a control group would have helped you to understand it better. So, for example, and the sample hypothesis 1, the last statement is, because the study did not employ a non-discovery or control class, it's difficult to say X, Y, and Z. So it might have showed you something positive. We could have learned more from a control group. Maybe it wasn't possible because you only had one classroom. You needed to treat all the students the same. There's various reasons why you wouldn't have used a control group, or why something that you couldn't do would have made the study better. So that could be part of your analysis of the results. So basically this is taking those numbers and those statistics that you are talking about in 4 and turning it into a discussion and a reasoning in Chapter 5. You can talk about theoretical explanations and implications from the lit review. You might not have a theoretical explanation for each one, but if there was something that directly points to it, you know, something that the literature that you found indicates that this theory has been developed and the theory was supported or not supported in your hypothesis, you can mention that. It is important to refer back to your lit review to have this, what you found, where did what you find relate to your lit review. So was it supported in some of the literature? Did you find something different than what the literature has? Maybe some of you had literature that was both it had a positive and a negative outcome, and I just mean in terms of your hypothesis. You can talk about the differences between why it agreed with it, why it didn't agree with it. So this is the kind of payoff for the whole thing that you've been working on, and you need to kind of close that loop in order to look back at your lit review and make your research make sense in terms of the examples you had in your lit review and what happened in your own experiment. You can also talk about additional research findings here, interesting observations. Some of you, I know some of you kept research journals and made additional notes, and you can talk to it in the sample under hypothesis 4. They included actually some of the additional observations under 4. You can do it as a separate observation also, but under 4, what they included as at the bottom of the page, the writer says, although results for hypothesis regarding the gain in content knowledge was found to be significant, listening to students' comments and reading their journal entries revealed that the students had mainly attained surface knowledge and did not apply critical thinking. So anything that directly impacted your hypothesis that you kept track of in your research journal can go under your hypothesis, or you can also talk about additional research findings, something interesting that came out of the notes you were taking, or additional observations that you made, or additional surveys that you made can be included under additional research findings. In order for it to be in the separate additional research findings section, you need to put some of those, like a chart of those findings or a graph of the findings or a table into your chapter 4. So there may be things that you just find that you want to discuss in order to complete chapter 5 that we may want to go back and add a small section in chapter 4. Some of you we've just discussed a little bit of where that might fit in, but if you find that there's something that you really want to talk about that doesn't fit into a hypothesis but needs to be a separate observation, we can talk about how to just add a small section in chapter 4 so that you can discuss it here. So actually the impact of these findings on the outcomes of the hypothesis should probably go into the separate hypothesis, but additional observations that are separate and give you other, lead you to draw other conclusions and analyze your hypothesis analyze something separate from an effect on your hypothesis should go in additional findings. Then there's a conclusion section, and it's not conclusion to the paper, it's conclusions about your research. So you want to cycle this back to your, make sure you cycle this back to your original statement of the problem that you talked about in chapter 1. Sorry, I'm having all these things. Lots of paper here. So what light did this research shed on the problem you stated in chapter 1 in the purpose of the study and what you hope to find out? Did you find out what you wanted to? You can also talk about your limitations of your study here, what further research should be done, not that you're necessarily going to do it, but what further research would you do if you were going to carry this on. And again, you want to fit this in with the literature from chapter 2, your lit review. So if you notice, the conclusions in the sample are rather short, and you could go on, you could add a little bit more to this. But she talks about limitations, issues that you had in the thing. What she hasn't given here is much about chapter 2, but basically you want to take your analysis and make it holistic here. Take your hypothesis, look at your purpose of your study and your statement of the problem, and wrap that back up together here. Then you want to do a section on educational implications. What is the implication for your practice based on your findings? So not the ideas that you might have or personal opinions you might have, but based on your findings, based on the data you collected, based on the observations you made. You can refer back to the lit review, and even if your results did not support this hypothesis, it has implications for practice. For example, if it didn't support the hypothesis, it means either you need to dive back into the research to see what was different, or you need to decide if the limitations were severe enough that you're not going to accept that it didn't support your hypothesis. You may want to say that, I think one of you mentioned that in some of the studies it would take up to, they're suggesting doing the intervention for a year, and of course we didn't have a year to do that. So maybe the results, because of the low duration, did not support your hypothesis, but you agree with what you're seeing in the literature, and you might have had some slight indication of an upward trend, or a downward trend if it's getting rid of a negative behavior, an upward trend if you're a positive behavior. That leads you to suspect that this would be a good thing to continue, and therefore you are going to include this change in your practice even though your results were not supported. And then finally, you want to have a short summary and conclusion just to finish up your paper. This does not have to be long. You want to summarize your conclusions. You want to talk about future research or avenues of exploration, and just make a nice concluding paragraph that ends the paper and doesn't just kind of peter out on a sentence. So that is it for the chapter 5. And of course, if you want to, I don't know if we actually need to meet before you write this. If you want to contact me, we can talk about it. If you want to write a draft, then send it to me and I'll read it. However you want to do that. I'm also going to be reading your chapter 4s once they come in, and sending them back to you. I might set up a meeting, actually chapter 4 and 5, or chapter 4 if I need to talk to you, if it's just a few edits. I might just indicate and send it back to you depending on where we need to go. And always, if you want to set up a meeting with me, I am happy to meet with you. So that's it, and I'll be talking to you.